I'm Olivia from Reno, Nevada, and you're listening to The Wild Idea.
Welcome to our Conversations for a Wild and Connected World, what we call the Wild Idea Podcast. My name is Bill Hodge, and along with my co-host Anders Reynolds, we bring a deep passion for and a history of working for wild places and exploring the ideas that live at the intersection of wild nature and human nature. Today, we're talking to a longtime friend and colleague, Sarah Francisco, someone I met right when my public land journey started to turn to advocacy and action, and which also ultimately led me to my friend Anders Reynolds.
Oh, hi, ho, ho, Bill. How are you? Merry Christmas.
I'm good. I've been busy. I've been super busy.
Oh, yeah?
Shopping for the holidays. Matter of fact, while we're on that, I just want to make sure I have your Christmas wish list correct.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you're a big reader, so not surprising that there are several books in here. So this one is called The Lover's Guide to the Family Reunion. I'm assuming that's like a Arkansas thing. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
A Metro's Guide to Hosting Obscure Dinner Parties. Is that another one? I know you're sort of into weird dinner parties. Is that right? And then some of these seem really out of character. A J.D. Vance edition of Stretch Armstrong.
Does that exist? That actually would make my list. I think you're trying to troll me, but now I want that.
I just want to say the last one I will not be getting you for Christmas, which is a donation to Mike Lee's re-election campaign. I'm just not going to be able to do that for you. So, but as long as I get the list right, I'm ready to get my shopping done.
That's a sweet list, Bill. You know, I had a gift for you too. It's a little bit different. I'd put together like a little box of memories with like pictures of you and I from all the places we've been, you know, and then like a little map where I'd marked out with stars and hearts and stuff, maybe where we take some future vacations. So, you know, I realize you're trying to shank me a little bit here, but I took the spirit of the season seriously. And I just want to say, like, I appreciate you so much, buddy. I love you, bud. I wish I were there to just boop you right on the nose this Christmas.
Yeah. I love that you act like you're the magnanimous one here.
Bill, what's your favorite Christmas movie?
You know, It's a Wonderful Life, I think, is probably my favorite Christmas movie. What's yours? Was it the one you just described?
Well, I mean, that's the one I can say. My real favorite Christmas movie is a Quebecois movie from like the 1960s called Mon Oncle Antoine. But it's one of those things where you've got to separate like the art from the artist on this thing, because the director has since been outed as maybe not a very good person. So anyway, the movie is.
So what you're saying is Bad Santa is not your favorite Christmas movie?
Bad Santa 2. Bad Santa 2.
It's not. I mean, Billy Bob is a national treasure.
Well, you just made fun of our Kansans, and that included Billy Bob. So it's on you, man.
It's all on me. Hey, y'all. Sarah Francisco leads Southern Environmental Law Center's Virginia office, and as an attorney, she has spent a career working to sort of form and focus the conservation of the national forests of the Southern Appalachians, a place that I call home, a place that I hold dear. It is the mountain backbone of the South, and she's worked with so many local partners, and which is how we first met, to shape forest management, to work on forest restoration plans, and obviously curtail some really questionable projects along the way. So Sarah, let me just welcome you to the show and say it is such an honor to have you join us today.
Gosh, thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have the chance to have this conversation with y'all. Thanks so much for having me.
Sarah, I'm so glad you're here. I love any time I can get with you. I look forward to going down to Charlottesville and seeing you every time I'm down there. You know, in anticipation of this interview, I reread Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales, which is this prosaic piece of literature that sort of filters the nostalgia of the holidays through the eyes of a child. And it includes some really wonderful and also some like bittersweet vignettes, not just about the people in this person's life, but also like an almost enchanted sense of the landscape. And I was wondering if you could do that for us. When you think back to your own childhood, growing up on a Christmas tree farm, what scenes or sensations come back to you?
Well, Anders, it might be a little bit less enchanted than what Dylan Thomas relayed, although I have not read that. And as an English major, I definitely need to go back and fill in that key gap in my education. But yeah, happy to tell you a little bit about it. So I grew up on a farm in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, in Augusta County. This is a farm that my grandparents bought when they got married in the 40s, and my dad has lived there his whole life. He's still there running the farm. And, I always just felt like our farm and really our whole part of the Shenandoah Valley was just such a special place. I really kind of had that real just appreciation for the landscape, for our farm, for this part of the Shenandoah Valley, really from the beginning. Like a lot of farms in the Shenandoah Valley, we kind of have the main business part, and then, there's other things happening there on the farm. So, our main business is Christmas trees, and I can talk a little bit about that. But we also, we had a couple horses. I raised meat lambs and had a little herd of sheep. That was kind of my project for a long time. So, just really enjoyed kind of being part of that and just being part of the kind of the way of life on the farm. It was really a special way to grow up. And I think, sometimes we don't always appreciate our childhoods, but then we do more, kind of when we look back. But what really stands out for me is just how much I, cared about the farm and the land, kind of from the very beginning. So.
And do those early memories like shape the conservation work you do now? I mean, Dylan Thomas captures childhood as a place where like the land feels almost alive. Did growing up on a Christmas tree farm give you that same sense that landscapes can have personality or mood or whatever?
Oh, definitely. Well, I think anyone that depends on the land for their livelihood has both the appreciation and the respect, but also often the sense that sometimes the land and Mother Nature isn't always on our side. You have to work with what you have. You have to respect it and take care of it, but then you have to, deal with different realities that come up. We would run out of water sometimes in the summertime. And, our growing up on the farm, our drinking water comes from a spring. I mean, it literally comes out of the ground, goes into a pipe and comes out again in our house. And, we would have droughts and we would run out of water. And, it just gives you a very concrete connection, between those natural resources and kind of your day-to-day life. With the Christmas trees, Christmas trees are pretty hardy. But, one year we had such a bad drought that we actually just so many seedlings died that we just ripped everything up and started over again the next year, and it's pretty tough wake-up call. And it, that kind of makes me think differently about topics that we talk about a lot today, like climate change and how extreme weather really affects people's homes and lives and livelihoods. But it's not all that tough and gritty day to day, right? And, one of the really wonderful things about the Christmas trees is, the holiday season, right? I mean, this is kind of going back to your first question about, the holiday time. It's, it was so, just so enjoyable and rewarding to see families come out to the farm to cut their tree. Our farm, we've always had, cut your own tree and families come and, oftentimes, there's grandparents and kids and grandkids all coming out, to get their tree and it's, they get a saw and they walk out in the field to pick out their own tree and, kids are running around and just kind of being part of that joy, that tradition. And then seeing your farm and your land kind of reflected with appreciation through someone else's eyes as they're visiting and participating in a tradition that's important to them. That's just a really special experience. So, it's not all, Mother Nature being against you and drought and running out of water. There's the, really special part about, growing that tree. It takes years to grow a Christmas tree, putting a lot into that and then seeing, families really, coming out, enjoying the farm, and selecting a tree, and just kind of that excitement about it. So that's a really special part of this particular business.
Yeah, hearing you describe that, the challenges that come with that life, and we have probably more in common than you and I both already know. I was born on a family farm not far from where you grew up in the Allegheny Highlands of West Virginia, in Hampshire County. Farm. It's been in our family since 1762, I think 1763, and it makes me really think about the kind of that you can fall in love with the idea of wildlands while embracing working lands, right? Like you said, it makes you recognize that Mother Nature can both be a friend and an adversary, or can be something you have to overcome in certain ways. But there's also just, the nostalgia piece of it. I think of our farm in West Virginia as something that is still the hub in which my life revolves around, even though my life has now flung me out to a place like Montana and working on things like public lands issues. I'm still, that hub calls back to me. And it also makes me respect the working lands here in Montana that immediately adjoin wildlands, right? And so it's just kind of interesting to think about, that's also that part of your journey, that it's informed your work now in Virginia and across the Southern Appalachians.
Bill, you're exactly right. And, one of the things that really stands out to me when I think about our farm and my experiences growing up, is that we had this very clear sense of kind of the working part of the farm and the more natural part of the farm. We have the Christmas tree fields where you're raising a crop. It's a 7 to 9 year long rotation crop, but you're thinking about things like, trying to limit your pesticides and, conserve soil quality and, manage appropriate rotations and things like that. And you're growing, but you're growing a crop. And then, there's more, there's woods on our farm that are just, hardwoods that have really recovered, in the last, 100 years or so since the kind of heavy, turn of the century, early 1900s logging in our region. And, this is a beautiful forest with big old trees. And, that's kind of the natural part. My dad and I would take these walks, when I was a kid, and, we would take a walk in the woods, literally. And that was such a great experience. And, you enjoy that more, sort of that big forest where there's more natural processes happening, and you kind of get that sense of this little, fragment of a more, kind of where the ecosystem itself is what's dominating, and, really appreciated and enjoyed that. So, it was interesting. And when I started working on national forest conservation, I kind of came into that with the sense that we can have different uses for these lands. We don't have to have every use in every place. And we want to have, our areas where we have, a real focus on conservation or preservation. And we may have areas that, have a different focus. So it's, kind of gives you a sense of what working lands are. And then, for me, really informed how I felt differently about public lands and what some of the priorities should be, in those places. As
you've carried all these lessons about working lands and public lands that you learned on some of those early landscapes with you, you've now stepped into a role where you're shaping how Virginia's natural resources are protected. As the Virginia State Director of the Southern Environmental Law Center, what parts of the job feel most connected to that early sense of place where you grew up?
Anders, protecting our national forests in Virginia is one of our top priorities for this office. And of course, it's something that is, really near and dear to me. And I know y'all have talked a lot already on this program about the attacks on the Roadless Rule. But, I think it's when we talk about conservation priorities in Virginia, I feel like it's really important to talk about this. Our national forests here in Virginia, the George Washington and the Jefferson National Forests, contain more roadless acres than any other national forest this side of the Mississippi River. And, Virginians have really, come together, many times really over the last several decades to support the adoption of the Roadless Rule in the first place, to, urge that it be retained the last time it was attacked. And, we're seeing Virginians rally again to continue to keep these protections in place. If protections for roadless areas are scrapped, almost 350,000 acres are some of the most beautiful and most important national forest lands in Virginia would be vulnerable. And that's just something that SCLC is not going to let happen. And I know that that's the case really for all of the local groups and local residents that we've worked with over the years to protect these places. We're just not going to let this happen.
Let's stop here and do a little history lesson, because you're right. We did want to get into roadless with you. You were deeply involved in the establishment of the Roadless Rule, one of the landmark public lands battles of our time. Bill and I are going to dedicate the entire month of January of next year, which happens to be the 25th anniversary of the Roadless Rule, to telling stories about its role in protecting wild places. But could you take a minute to tell listeners about SCLC's role in getting the Clinton administration to take action way, way back in the 20th century?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So when I came to SCLC, I actually started as an associate attorney in 2002. And so SCLC had really helped get the rule in place. And then when I started, we were actively defending the Roadless Rule against the attacks on the rule coming from the Bush administration. So SCLC attorney David Carr, the first leader of our Forests and Public Lands program, and so many organizations all around the Southern Appalachians were really instrumental in helping to provide that essential support for the Roadless Rule when the Forest Service was first considering it under the Clinton administration. And actually, I shouldn't say first considering it, because there's been an effort to protect roadless areas ever since they were first inventoried and identified in the 1970s. But when the Clinton administration picked this up and the Forest Service was considering it, a key part of highlighting the importance of these areas was for groups from the South to speak up and to highlight roadless areas in the Southern Appalachians that are so important to local communities as outdoor recreation destinations, oftentimes as sources of local drinking water. These are places that are very familiar to people and are close to rural communities and, within an easy drive of really a lot of our, larger metropolitan areas in the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. And it really helped to make the conversation about roadless protections a national conversation and not just a conversation about the, largest and most remote areas in the Western U.S. And those areas are beautiful. They're spectacular. They're important. All of these areas deserve to be protected, but it was really important for groups in the South to be speaking up and to just help make this conversation more of a conversation about why we needed these national protections. This wasn't just a Western lands issue. It was really a national public lands issue. And we also have seen, really strong bipartisan support for protecting roadless areas as really prime areas for fishing and hunting. And again, having Southerners be speaking up for these places that they know they love has been really important to both showing why it's important to protect these areas and then helping to keep them protected. And, so that's a little bit of kind of the history of, SCLC's role and so many organizations all around the country, have been involved. I think we played an important part in SCLC and local allies around the Southern Appalachians played an important part in highlighting, the Southern and the Southern Appalachian perspective on these areas. And, we've been able to work with so many great organizations, as I said, all around the country to help get these protections in place and keep them.
As somebody who's spent time in the East working in conservation and now spent time in the West, I think I really appreciate you bringing up the idea that the work of SCLC and others, but specifically SCLC in the East, making the Roadless Rule a national issue, I think is a part of what I believe we still have to do to this day on so many conservation issues, which is making sure people see themselves in these things. And like if it had been left to sort of a Western battle over roadless, I mean, 2/3 of our country's population lives in the East, and they wouldn't have seen themselves in those battles. And sort of pivoting to a related but different subject, in the last few weeks, we've covered pretty disturbing testimony from the Associate Chief of the Forest Service in front of Congress when it comes to areas recommended for wilderness. And the reason I want to flag this for you is I know how grounded you are in the collaborative approach of working with local community groups of all types, not just those that are focused on protection or preservation versus conservation, but also working with folks in the timber, forest products world, all of those sort of things. And I kind of just want to touch on this with you. You and I first met as part of a campaign in Tennessee that had come out of a forest plan. We had a champion for our bill at the time, Senator Lamar Alexander, who specifically said, I'll only do a bill for these wilderness acres that the agency has recommended, which is what we ended up getting done. Surprised all of us, a bill signed by Donald Trump in 2018. But we now have the Forest Service, or USDA, depending on how you want to interpret his testimony, saying that they no longer recommend acres that they recommended in other forest plans. And that's a pretty big gut punch to community organizations and even to agency employees, right, that have put sometimes decades worth of work into this, to suddenly be told that on a whim, we're no longer going to follow all of the work that went into compromise and to thinking about what is a place where we need to do restoration versus places that could benefit from preservation, right?
Bill, I'm really glad that you brought this up, because I think your point about the public being involved and this locally driven approach to developing recommendations for our forest plans and for conservation and protection of national forest lands is really important. And I really think that's a fundamental point of the National Forest Management Act and the Wilderness Act. The whole idea behind these laws regarding the management of our national forests is that the Forest Service develops a long-term, multi-year management plan for our national forests, and that plan is developed with an extensive amount of input within the Forest Service by scientists, by ecologists, biologists, fisheries biologists, all those perspectives, and of course, including forest management and timber perspectives, and that the Forest Service gets a tremendous amount of input from the local public about what people want to see in their public lands. And the best forest plans are the ones that really can synthesize these different perspectives and develop the best approach. And that public voice is critically important. And when you have a forest plan that is informed by local citizen recommendations, and where the local Forest Service staff that know these areas the best recommend, areas for either for forest plan level protections, or then recommend certain areas for congressional designation as wilderness areas, for the agency to then just basically do a 180 and completely disavow its own recommendations, it really casts a huge shadow over this entire process, because people participate in the development of forest plans, and they really come to the table to try to develop the best protections and the best recommendations to Congress, and often make compromises versus what they would like to see, because there's other interests at the table. And when that all sort of just gets thrown out the window, I think it's really hard for people to have confidence that their public lands are going to be managed with respect for their voices, and with a sense that they can, have some predictability around the decisions. And it's hugely problematic to see that happening. So I'm as disappointed as you are to see that playing out. Here in Virginia, local residents and other forest users came together during the revision of the George Washington Forest Plan a number of years ago to develop a set of recommendations, really consensus-driven, compromise-driven recommendations for logging and forest and wildlife management within the national forest, and a set of recommendations for wilderness and national scenic area protections. And when I see, what's happening within the Forest Service today, and when I think particularly about this process that we and that a lot of local allies were involved in, these proposals are crafted by people who know these lands the best. And it's really important that the Forest Service continue to listen to those local voices. And in many cases, the local Forest Service staff that also know these lands the best were at the table and help to inform these recommendations. And it's just really important that we stay the course when the agency's been supporting these proposals and when they really make sense from every perspective, from a forest management perspective, oftentimes from a fiscal perspective and a local economy perspective as well.
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate you bringing in that specific example of Virginia. I think it's worth noting for all three of us and for our audience that what we're talking about here, these recommendations that go to Congress, Congress has the choice whether to act on them or not. And obviously those are further stimulated by public input, right? By the public asking their delegation to take forward this recommendation and turn it into an act of Congress, which is the way in which we grow and expand the wilderness preservation system. I think the timing of the day we're recording this episode is interesting. It is the anniversary of the Tennessee Wilderness Act that we often talk about in our shared history, particularly for the three of us, that became a part of the Farm Bill in 2018 and passed into law on this day that we're recording this. And that was not the work of a few months or a few weeks. It was the work of years. I think about colleagues like Hugh Irwin, who had worked on the Cherokee Forest Plan back into the 80s to inform these things. And I just really think it's really helpful to help the public understand, because not everybody engages. Not everybody has the time or the capacity to go to every public meeting that the agency has. But I think it's so important for people to understand that other people do get out and engage and compromise and then engage in the process of drumming up enough public support to get elected officials to act. And I think that's why we all do the work we do, right?
Yeah. Congressional approval of these projects is the last step. And often when I'm talking about these projects, including the ones that Sarah just mentioned on the Hill, I often use the phrase like, this is a promise kept. And that's not just like a stylized talking point that was created by some, marketing genius. In fact, I'm the opposite of a marketing genius. It's like a statement of fact, right? And it's a statement of fact for the reasons that Sarah outlined earlier. In many cases, this isn't these bills aren't the brainchild of one person, but rather they're the product of a lot of disparate forest users engaging in very, very difficult conversations to come together and decide what is best for their big backyard, wherever that big backyard may be. And what I'm hearing and some of what the two of you are going and back and forth about the Forest Service is traditionally we've had, the Forest Service there to also be one of those local shareholders and participate in the process. And it feels like, looking at some of the testimony we've heard recently in the Senate, that's starting to change. That some of the issues that we've had, that we've always had in convincing senators who aren't from that state but are in charge of the relevant committee, for example, or senators from across the nation, but who you still need to vote for the bill in order to get it to pass. You've always had to make compromise there, but now for the first time, we're having to worry about the Forest Service itself being an actor with which you have to convince them, even though the recommendations were built in their forest plans, right? And to me, that's a really, my main emotion is that sounds very frustrating, but in all honesty, it's like a very alarming development.
Anders, I know that the members of the George Washington National Forest Collaborative felt that we were making promises to one another. I know that's certainly how SCLC and the Virginia Wilderness Committee and Friends of Shenandoah Mountain felt and still feel today. And I think the other members of the collaborative feel the same. And, I think another important point to make here is that public land management and conservation is not something that happens overnight. Like, I think for those who do a lot of public lands related work, it makes sense that we would work on something over several years, and we would implement it over time. And so we remember what we committed to do. And that institutional memory is really important. We're talking about natural systems and how to appropriately manage and conserve them over time. And for us, the work that we did around that forest plan, the George Washington Forest Plan was finalized in 2014. So that was more than 10 years ago. But to us, that was an important piece of work that we did to provide input that helped to shape that forest plan. And now we're doing the important work to implement it over time. And it's going to take time. And that feels very real and very current to us. I think sometimes there may be people within different presidential administrations or people who are more used to political timelines who, might just view all of that as ancient history, but it's not. It's a promise, and it's a plan for how to be good stewards of these important places. And for us, that's very real and current. And we really need our decision makers to, listen to the best informed local voices and make good decisions.
You're echoing something we heard from Martha Williams last week, which is, like political decision makers come and go, but these landscapes are forever. And you've got to be very, very careful about the decisions you make that impact them.
Sarah, I'm wondering if we could zoom out for a second for our audience that is all across the country. If you could maybe share a little bit about maybe what they don't know about the Southern Appalachians. As a child of Appalachia, as a advocate for Appalachia, maybe both through the lens of what they may not know and what the threats might be in that backbone of Southern life that is the Appalachians.
Oh gosh, Bill, that's a large question, but I'll try to respond. So, the Southern Appalachian region is such an extraordinary place. You mentioned it as being the backbone of the South. And from a public lands perspective, we have about 5 million acres of public land in the Southern Appalachian Mountains. We have a number of national forests. We also, of course, have Great Smoky Mountains National Park and Shenandoah National Park in there as well. And these mountain forests are surrounded by private land. We do have large blocks of national forest, but we also have a lot of public-private boundary. And so these areas are near cities and towns all around the region. And as we talked about a few minutes ago, they're really within an easy drive of many of the larger metro areas in the Mid-Atlantic and the South. And so these forests are, in many ways, when you are there, if you're in the national forest in Virginia or in North Georgia or Western North Carolina or East Tennessee, you park at a trailhead and you go heading out on your hike, or you grab your fishing rod and you start moving up a trout stream, and very quickly you feel that you are in a really remote and often majestic national forest and a really sometimes imposing mountain landscape. But these are also forests that are very close to where people live and work. And I think one of the things that I often find when I'm talking with folks about the Southern Appalachian Mountains is this lack of understanding about how globally significant these forests are, because they are so close to our backyard. These are some of the most diverse forest systems on the entire planet in terms of biodiversity. We have so many wildlife species that only live in the Southern Appalachians and oftentimes only in very particular places. We have drinking water supplies that are important for our local communities. So we rely on these forests, and they're also incredibly significant from a biodiversity perspective. But because they are so nearby, I think sometimes even folks who live here don't always have the appreciation for how really rare and precious these areas are. And I think folks around the country, may often think about some of the really kind of majestic Western mountain forests, or those, iconic, red rock monuments, in the Southwest. And those lands are, incredibly special and important as well. But folks may not understand how unique and precious the Southern Appalachian forests are. And you asked about threats. I think I mentioned a little bit ago, the way climate change and more frequent extreme weather events, whether we're talking about droughts or storms, can affect farms and farmers. But our national forests are really at risk as well. And we saw that in a truly tragic way when Hurricane Helene hit our region, and especially hit Western North Carolina so hard. And these extreme storms in a mountain landscape where you get this amount of rain is incredibly, incredibly destructive from a, flooding standpoint, from a landslide standpoint, from what that does to water quality, aquatic systems, the forest. So, extreme weather and other effects of climate change are really a major threat to these forests. And it's one of the things that makes me really wish that the Forest Service would be managing these national forests with more of a priority on their conservation and their restoration, because they're under so much threat from some of these effects that we can take action on as a country, and we can try to limit these effects, but a lot of these effects are being felt. And the Forest Service can really help these forests be more resilient and can help conserve these systems. And I would really love to see the Forest Service, embracing that as its higher priority, as opposed to focusing, particularly in this moment right now, where there's such an emphasis on extraction and on activities, ramping up activities that will, degrade these lands in the short term and make it harder for them to actually remain, resilient and healthy lands over time.
Sarah, we're so happy you could join us this week. It's a season of hope and homecoming. So let's make our last question about those values. Today, you're looking out over the whole Commonwealth instead of just one small farm. As Virginia State Director, what do you see as the environmental developments that give you the most hope for the landscapes like the one you grew up on?
The thing that gives me the most hope is how engaged people are and how much people all across Virginia care about where they're from, where they live. Virginians really love the Commonwealth, and we see that in the people that we work with, the organizations that we work with. I think we have such a strong sense of place, and we care so much about wanting to make sure that our communities are healthy and thriving into the future, and that these natural landscapes in Virginia are there for the future. And I think that is what I see when I talk to people, when I talk with the groups that we work with, and that investment and that sense of caring and that real sense of an obligation to do our part to make sure that our landscapes are healthy and thriving into the future. That gives me a lot of hope. So I would say all of our great partners, the people that we work with, how much people care.
What a great way to wrap up this conversation and to go into this time of year. Sarah, as somebody who got to work with you over the years, I'm just so thankful you would come on and just really appreciate the time with you today.
Oh, Bill, Anders, thank you so much. It's been really fun to have the chance to talk with y'all, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
Coming up on the Wild Idea podcast, we make some year-end resolutions with our friend Michelle Fulner from the Golden State Naturals podcast. And as you heard in our conversation with Sarah, we'll kick off the new year exploring roadless landscapes that are part of the mosaic of America's wildlands and the federal policy that protects those places. If you like the Wild Idea, we hope you'll subscribe, give us a review in your favorite podcast app, or recommend us to a friend. And if you want to go a little deeper in what we're doing here and what we talk about, you can sign up for our newsletter at thewildidea.com. And we hope you find peace and love in the season, and we wish you a happy holidays.
The Wild Idea is a production of Wild Idea Media and hosted by Bill Hodge and Anders Reynolds. Production and editing by Bren Russell at Podlad. Digital support by Holly Wilkaszewski at Daypack Digital. Our theme music, Spring Hill Jack, is from Railroad Earth and was composed by John Skehan. Our executive producer and ringleader is Laura Hodge. You can find The Wild Idea wherever you listen to or download your favorite podcast. If you have a minute, please take a minute to give us a rating. And if you really like us, we hope you'll subscribe. Learn more about us at thewildidea.com.